March 10th, 1943. If General George Smith Patton hadn't taken command of the Second Corps that day, the United States Army would have faced humiliation in North Africa. Not just defeat, not just a setback, complete and utter humiliation at the hands of Germany's most celebrated general, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. The situation was desperate. 2 weeks earlier, at a place called Kasserine Pass, American forces had been shattered. 5,000 casualties. The worst defeat in United States military history in the North African theater. German panzers had torn through inexperienced American troops like a hot knife through butter. Young men from farms and cities across the United States lay dead in the desert sand, and their commanders had no answer for Rommel's tactical brilliance. They called General George Smith Patton Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines, his own blood, his men's guts. That's what the nickname meant, and every soldier who served under him knew it. He was a warrior from another age, wearing pearl-handled pistols on his hips, cursing like a demon, and fighting like an angel of death. But even Old Blood and Guts faced his greatest challenge now. The German Africa Corps was victorious, confident, and led by a military genius. Rommel had never lost a major engagement. The Desert Fox had outmaneuvered the British for 2 years, earning the respect of Winston Churchill himself, and now he had just humiliated the United States Army. In Washington, politicians panicked. In London, British commanders questioned whether American troops could fight at all. Across the United States, families opened telegrams announcing their sons were dead, captured, or missing. The nation's pride hung in the balance. General Dwight Eisenhower made the call. Only one man could salvage this disaster. Only one. Commander had the iron will and tactical genius to face Rommel's battle-hardened veterans. He summoned George Smith Patton. When Old Blood and Guts arrived at Second Corps headquarters on that March day, he found an army in shambles. Officers wore whatever uniforms they pleased. Discipline had collapsed. Men walked around unshaven, without helmets, slouching like civilians in a bread line. The defeat at Kasserine had broken their spirit. Patton stood before them, ramrod straight in his immaculate uniform, those famous ivory-handled pistols gleaming at his sides. His pale blue eyes swept over the assembled officers like searchlights hunting for prey. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice sharp as a cavalry saber, "I am here because the United States Army needs someone who knows how to kill Germans. You have forgotten how to be soldiers. I will remind you." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Some had tears in their eyes, remembering the boys they'd lost at Kasserine. "The enemy thinks you are cowards," Patton continued. "The British think you are incompetent. Even your own countrymen doubt you can fight. But I know something they don't know." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the North African heat. "You are United States soldiers, and United States soldiers do not run. They do not surrender. They attack, they kill, they win." But Old Blood and Guts was about to change history in a way that no one expected. He wouldn't just restore American pride. He would defeat Rommel without ever meeting him face to face on the battlefield. He would prove that strategic genius could triumph over tactical brilliance. He would show the world that the United States had finally arrived as a military power. This is what happened next. March 15th, 1943. George Smith Patton sat in a command tent studying maps by lamplight. Intelligence reports covered his desk. Every document told the same story. Rommel was preparing another, offensive. The Desert Fox planned to destroy the United States Second Corps before it could recover from Kasserine. A meeting was called at Allied headquarters. British General Harold Alexander, overall commander of Allied ground forces in North Africa, looked skeptically at the American officers gathered around the map table. "The German attack will come here," Alexander said, pointing to a mountain pass called El Guettar. "Rommel will attempt to cut our supply lines and drive the Americans into the sea." The British officers nodded. They'd seen Rommel do this before. "We should withdraw to more defensible positions," suggested an American general. "Pull back, regroup, wait for reinforcements." Silence filled the tent. Every officer knew what that meant: another retreat. Another admission that American forces couldn't stand against the Africa Corps. Then George Smith Patton spoke. "Gentlemen, there will be no withdrawal." All eyes turned to Old Blood and Guts. "General Patton," Alexander said carefully, "Rommel has never been defeated in a planned offensive. He has destroyed every force that tried to meet him head-on. Your Second Corps is demoralized, understrength, and inexperienced." "Which is exactly why we must attack," Patton replied. The tent erupted in protests. Attack against Rommel, the greatest German general of the war, with troops who'd just been routed at Kasserine. "You're suggesting suicide," a British colonel said flatly. Patton's eyes went cold. "I'm suggesting we remember that the United States Army does not lose wars. Rommel thinks we're beaten. He thinks we're demoralized. He thinks we'll sit and wait for him to destroy us." He leaned over the map, his finger stabbing at El Guettar. "So we're going to hit him first. We're going to attack before he attacks. We're going to go into his throat and rip it out." General Alexander studied George Smith Patton carefully. The American was either brilliant or insane, perhaps both. "If you fail," Alexander said quietly, "the United States will be out of this war. The Second Corps will be destroyed. Thousands of men will die. Your country's reputation will never recover." Old Blood and Guts smiled. A predator's smile, cold and dangerous. "I won't fail. Give me 10 days. 10 days to train these men. 10 days to prepare. Then watch what United States soldiers can do when they're properly led." What the generals in that tent didn't know was that George Smith Patton had already begun implementing a revolutionary plan. Not just a battle plan, a psychological warfare operation that would defeat Rommel before the first shot was fired. Back at Second Corps headquarters, Patton had unleashed hell on his own troops. Not enemy fire, something worse. Military discipline so strict, so unforgiving, that combat seemed easier by comparison. Every soldier had to wear their helmet at all times. Every man had to shave every morning. Uniforms had to be complete and correct. Officers who appeared without neckties faced immediate relief of command. Patton personally toured the camps, handing out $50 fines to soldiers caught without proper uniform. "If you don't have pride in yourself," he roared at assembled battalions, "you sure as hell won't have pride in combat." The men hated him at first. They called him a tyrant, a peacock, a son of a bitch. But something was changing. They stood straighter. They saluted crisply. They looked like soldiers again instead of defeated refugees. Old Blood and Guts was rebuilding their warrior spirit, piece by piece, man by man. He instituted brutal training regimens, live fire exercises, forced marches through the desert, tank maneuvers that continued through the night. When men complained about the heat, Patton appeared in the training areas personally, standing in the sun for hours, demonstrating that their commanding general would never ask them to endure what he wouldn't endure himself. "The Desert Fox bleeds just like you do," he told them. "His tanks break down, his men get tired, his supply lines stretch thin. He is not a god, he is a German officer and we are going to kill him." But could Old Blood and Guts really pull it off? Rommel had beaten the British 8th Army repeatedly. He'd outsmarted the finest military minds that Britain could send against him. He'd turned warfare in the desert into an art form, using speed, surprise, and tactical genius to defeat superior numbers again and again. George Smith Patton was betting everything on a simple principle: the best defense is a good offense. While every military expert expected the Americans to hunker down and wait for Rommel's assault, Old Blood and Guts was preparing to strike first. March 25th, 1943. The date was set. The United States Second Corps would attack at El Guettar. They would drive into the German positions and force Rommel to respond to them instead of executing his own plan. Military historians gave Patton's plan almost no chance of success. The men were too green. The wounds from Kasserine were too fresh. And they faced Erwin Rommel, undefeated, supremely confident, the master of desert warfare. The next 72 hours would determine the fate of the United States Army in North Africa. They would prove whether American soldiers could stand against Germany's best. They would show the world whether Old Blood and Guts was a genius or a fool. Dawn would break on March 26th, and with it, the battle that would define George Smith Patton's legend. But first, He had one more preparation to make. March 25th, 1943, sunset. General George Smith Patton stood before his tank commanders and infantry officers in a staging area near El Guettar. Behind him, thousands of United States soldiers made final preparations for the attack that would begin at dawn. "Gentlemen," Old Blood and Guts said, his voice carrying across the assembled officers, "tomorrow we attack, not because we're ordered to, not because we have to, but because we're United States soldiers, and that's what we do." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Some of you are thinking about Kasserine. Some of you are scared. Good. Fear is what keeps you sharp. But let me tell you what the Germans are thinking tonight." Patton pulled out a captured German intelligence report. This document says, and I quote, "American forces remain disorganized following Kasserine defeat. Second Corps combat effectiveness is minimal. They will not resist determined assault. That's what the Desert Fox thinks of you." The officers stirred angrily. "Tomorrow morning," George Smith Patton continued, "we're going to teach Herr Rommel a lesson. We're going to show him that the United States doesn't run. We don't surrender. We attack, we fight, and we win." What happened over the next 72 hours would shock the military world and establish Old Blood and Guts as one of history's greatest combat commanders. March 26, 1943, 0300 hours. 3 hours before dawn, United States artillery batteries opened fire. 500 guns thundered simultaneously, hurling high explosive shells into German positions. The barrage lasted 45 minutes. The most concentrated artillery fire the United States Army had ever unleashed in North Africa. German troops scrambled from their sleep, diving into foxholes and trenches. The earth shook. Fire bloomed across the desert night. This wasn't the action of a defeated, demoralized army. This was thunder and fury, 0445 hours. Under cover of darkness, American infantry began advancing. They moved through wadis and ravines, using the terrain exactly as Patton had drilled them. When German machine guns opened fire, American mortar. Teams suppressed them. When panzers appeared, American tank destroyers engaged them from concealed positions. This wasn't the confused, panicked force that Rommel had routed at Kasserine. This was a disciplined, aggressive army executing a coordinated plan. George Smith Patton wasn't sitting in a rear headquarters. Old Blood and Guts was right there, 3 miles behind the front line, riding in a command vehicle, monitoring radio reports, adjusting tactics in real time. When a regiment got pinned down by enemy fire, Patton personally drove to their position. "Move forward or I'll shoot you myself," he roared at a company commander who'd taken cover. The men advanced. The German 10th Panzer Division, veterans of Kasserine, counterattacked at 0700 hours. 50 tanks rumbled toward American positions, expecting the Americans to break and run as they had before. They didn't run. American tank destroyers, positioned in carefully prepared ambush sites, opened. Fire at 800 yards. German tanks exploded. Panzers burned. The American gunners had been trained by Old Blood and Guts himself in the preceding weeks, and their shooting was devastating. The German attack stalled. Then, United States fighter bombers appeared overhead. Patton had coordinated with the Army Air Forces for maximum close air support. P-40 Warhawks screamed down, strafing German positions, bombing tank concentrations. By noon on March 26th, the German counterattack had failed. Rommel's veterans, who'd never been stopped by American forces, were retreating. But this was only day one, March 27th, 1943. Rommel received the battle reports personally. His intelligence officers looked shaken. "Herr General Feldmarschall," one said hesitantly, "the Americans have captured Hill 609. They're advancing toward Gabes. Their attacks are coordinated, professional." Rommel studied the maps in silence. Something had changed. The broken, defeated force from Kasserine had transformed into an efficient fighting machine. "Who commands the Americans now?" Rommel asked. "A general named Patton, sir. George Smith Patton." Rommel knew that name. A cavalryman, a student of military history, a warrior. "So," the Desert Fox said quietly, "the Americans finally sent someone who knows how to fight." What Rommel didn't know was that George Smith Patton had been studying him for months. Old Blood and Guts had read every report on Rommel's tactics. He'd analyzed every battle the Desert Fox had fought. He knew how Rommel thought, how he maneuvered, how he concentrated his forces for devastating counterstrokes. And Patton had prepared for all of it. When German reconnaissance reported that American supply convoys were moving along a certain road, Rommel ordered an attack, his classic tactic of cutting enemy logistics. The supply convoy was a decoy. When German tanks attacked it, they drove into a trap. American artillery, pre-positioned and waiting, opened fire. Tank destroyers emerged from hidden positions. The German attack collapsed with heavy losses. George Smith Patton had predicted Rommel's move and countered it before the Desert Fox even issued the order. March 28, 1943. United States forces captured Guettar. The town that was supposed to be the launching point for Rommel's offensive was now in American hands. The Second Corps continued advancing, pushing German forces back toward the coast. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler read the reports with growing fury. The Americans were winning. The supposedly incompetent, soft, inexperienced Americans were defeating his best troops in Africa. But the most crucial moment came on March 29, 1943. Rommel received new orders from Berlin. He was being recalled to Germany. The Desert Fox, undefeated in his planned offensives, master of mobile warfare, Hitler's favorite general, was being pulled out of Africa. Why? Because George Smith Patton had changed the strategic equation. By attacking first, by seizing the initiative, by transforming the United States Second Corps into an aggressive professional fighting force, Old Blood and Guts had made Rommel's planned offensive impossible. The great counterattack that was supposed to drive the Americans into the sea would never happen. Patton had defeated Rommel without ever facing him directly in battle. German officers who were captured in the days after Guettar told their interrogators something remarkable. They'd been terrified, not of American firepower, but of American determination. The soldiers they faced at Guettar bore no resemblance to the confused troops at Kasserine. These men fought with discipline, courage, and relentless aggression. It was like fighting a different army, one German captain said. They were professionals. They gave no quarter. Every position had to be taken with blood. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. George Smith Patton had taken a defeated, demoralized force and transformed it into Rommel's nightmare. He'd done it in 10 days. He'd done it with training, discipline, and sheer force of will. He'd studied his enemies so thoroughly that he could predict Rommel's moves before the Desert Fox made them. The Battle of Guettar continued for several more days, but the outcome was decided. The United States Army had proven it could fight and win against Germany's best. American forces would continue advancing through North Africa, eventually linking up with British forces and trapping the remaining Axis troops in Tunisia. But the strategic victory was won in those first 72 hours. When General George Smith Patton attacked first, seized the initiative, and forced Rommel to react instead of act, Old Blood and Guts changed the entire course of the North African campaign. German soldiers began calling, Patton der Blutiger Geist, the Bloody Ghost, a commander who appeared where he wasn't expected, who attacked when defense was anticipated, who turned military conventional wisdom on its head. The man who beat Rommel without ever meeting him face to face. April 2nd, 1943. The scale of George Smith Patton's achievement became clear. The United States Second Corps had advanced 40 miles into German-held territory. They'd captured 6,000 prisoners, destroyed dozens of tanks, and inflicted casualties that Rommel couldn't replace. More importantly, they'd shattered the myth of German invincibility. At Allied headquarters, British General Alexander reviewed the battle reports with something close to astonishment. Extraordinary, he murmured, reading casualty figures and territorial gains. Simply extraordinary. An aide entered. Sir, General Patton is here to report. George Smith Patton walked in, still wearing his combat uniform, dust from the front lines on his boots. Those pearl-handled pistols hung at his sides. General Alexander, Patton said crisply. George, Alexander replied, standing to shake his hand. I must apologize. I doubted you. I thought your attack plan was too aggressive, too risky. I was wrong. Old Blood and Guts smiled slightly. Sir, the The greatest risk would have been doing nothing. Rommel expected us to cower. We attacked. That's the difference between winning and losing. The Desert Fox has been recalled to Germany, Alexander said. Hitler is pulling him out of Africa entirely. Your offensive made his planned counterattack impossible. Patton nodded. Then we've accomplished what we set out to do. The United States Army has announced its arrival. But the most dramatic moment came later that day, when George Smith Patton visited his troops at Guettar. He stood on the hood of a jeep, addressing thousands of soldiers who'd just proven themselves in combat. These men had been defeated at Kasserine. They'd been mocked, doubted, written off. Now they were victors. Men of the Second Corps, Old Blood and Guts began, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks. 3 weeks ago, the world thought you were finished. The British doubted you. The Germans laughed at you. Even some of your own countrymen thought you couldn't fight. The soldiers stood silent, listening. You have proven them all wrong. You have shown that United States soldiers are second to none. You attacked when others would retreat. You advanced when others would hide. You fought like the warriors you are. Patton paused, his eyes sweeping across the men. The Desert Fox came to Africa undefeated. He crushed the British time and again. He thought Americans would be easy prey. Today, Erwin Rommel is being sent home in disgrace because you defeated him. You made it impossible for him to win. You broke his best troops. You proved that. American fighting men are the finest soldiers on earth. The men erupted in cheers. Officers who'd wept after Kasserine now stood with tears of pride. We have more fighting ahead, George Smith Patton continued. There are more Germans to kill, more ground to take, more victories to win, and we will win them all. Because you are United States soldiers, because you are the Second Corps, because you are my men. The cheering intensified. These soldiers would follow Old Blood and Guts anywhere now, to Sicily, to France, to Germany itself. But the most important testimony came from an unexpected source. Months later, after the war in North Africa ended completely, Allied intelligence intercepted a letter that Rommel had written to his wife. The Desert Fox, recuperating in Germany, reflected on his time in Africa. The American General Patton, Rommel wrote, is a very daring and skilled opponent. He understood desert warfare more quickly than any other Allied commander I've faced. Given equal resources, I believe he would be a match for any general alive. High praise from the Desert Fox himself. But there was more. Captured German officers, when interrogated about various Allied commanders, consistently rated General George Smith Patton as the most dangerous. Not Montgomery, who defeated Rommel at El Alamein. Not Alexander, the overall commander. Patton, Old Blood and Guts. The American warrior who'd studied Rommel so thoroughly that he could anticipate the great general's moves. We feared Patton, one German colonel admitted. He attacked like Rommel attacked. Fast, aggressive, unpredictable. He gave us no time to prepare, no opportunity to counterattack. It was like fighting our own tactics used against us. That was George Smith Patton's genius. He'd taken Rommel's own playbook, speed, aggression, initiative, and used it to defeat the master himself. April 15th, 1943. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, visited Patton's headquarters. George, Eisenhower said, I'm giving you the 7th Army. You'll lead the invasion of Sicily. Old Blood and Guts nodded. Another campaign. Another battle. Another chance to prove United States soldiers were the finest fighting men in the world. The British still think we can't fight, Patton said. Sicily will prove them wrong again. Eisenhower smiled. George, after what you did at Guettar, nobody doubts the American soldier anymore. You took a broken corps and turned it into an elite fighting force in 10 days. You beat Rommel, without ever meeting him in direct combat. That's not just military skill, that's genius. General George Smith Patton had done what everyone said was impossible. He'd restored American military pride. He'd defeated Germany's greatest general. He'd proven that the United States had truly arrived as a military power capable of standing against anyone. And he'd done it by being exactly what his nickname suggested, Old Blood and Guts, a warrior who led from the front, who demanded excellence, who accepted no excuses, and who won against all odds. The legend of George Smith Patton had been forged in the desert sands of North Africa, where he proved that strategic brilliance could triumph over tactical genius, that preparation and discipline could overcome superior experience, and that the United States Army, properly led, was unstoppable. The impact of George Smith Patton's victory at Guettar rippled far beyond the immediate battlefield. In the weeks and months that followed, the entire complexion of the war changed. British commanders, who'd privately questioned whether American troops had the stomach for combat against veteran German forces, dramatically revised their assessments. General Bernard Montgomery, who'd been openly skeptical of United States military effectiveness, wrote to Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, "The Americans under Patton have shown themselves to be formidable fighters. He has instilled discipline and aggressive spirit into troops that appeared broken. It's a remarkable transformation." Coming from Montgomery, not known for praising others, this was extraordinary recognition. In Washington, the victory electrified military and civilian leadership. Secretary of War Henry Stimson declared that General Patton has demonstrated that American fighting men, properly trained and led, are equal to any soldiers in the world. President Franklin Roosevelt sent a personal telegram congratulating Old Blood and Guts on restoring the honor and fighting spirit of United States forces. But the most significant impact was on the German High Command. Adolf Hitler, reading reports of the Guettar battle, flew into a rage. How had his Afrika Korps, victorious for 2 years, been stopped by Americans? He demanded answers. German generals pointed to one factor: George Smith Patton. "This American general fights like our own panzer commanders," one Wehrmacht report noted. "He understands mobile warfare, concentration of force, and the value of seizing initiative. He has studied our tactics and turned them against us." Hitler ordered his intelligence services to compile everything known about Patton. What they discovered disturbed him. Old Blood and Guts wasn't some political general or staff officer given command as a favor. He was a warrior who'd spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of warfare. A student of military history who'd analyzed campaigns from Alexander the Great to Napoleon. A tank warfare pioneer who'd helped create United States armored doctrine in the 1920s and 30s. German military intelligence designated George Smith Patton as a primary threat and recommended that all commanders facing American forces should assume Patton-style aggressive tactics. The Desert Fox himself, Erwin Rommel, never faced Patton directly again after being recalled from North Africa. But in his post-war memoirs, published after Rommel's death in 1944, the Desert Fox wrote, "The battle that changed everything in Africa was not El Alamein, as the British claim, but Guettar. That is where the Americans proved they could fight, and where I first encountered a strategic mind equal to my own in General Patton. Equal to Rommel, from Rommel himself. No higher praise existed in military circles. The United States press, which had been demoralized after Kasserine, erupted with headlines celebrating Old Blood and Guts. Patton smashes Rommel, declared the New York Times. America's fighting general defeats Desert Fox, announced the Washington Post. Time magazine put George Smith Patton on its cover with the headline, Old Blood and Guts, the general who saved American honor. Newsreels showed footage of Patton in North Africa, standing in his Jeep with those famous ivory-handled pistols, addressing troops. Americans in theaters across the United States cheered. Here was a warrior general who looked and acted the part, who led from the front, who won. But perhaps the most telling aftermath came from the soldiers themselves, the men of the Second Corps who'd been defeated at Kasserine and then victorious at Guettar. Private First Class John Henderson, a tank driver from Ohio, wrote home to his parents, "We hated General Patton when he first arrived. He made us spit shine everything, wear our helmets constantly, march in the heat. We thought he was crazy, but when we attacked at Guettar, everything he taught us made sense. We were ready, we were disciplined, we were warriors, and we won. I'd follow Old Blood and Guts anywhere now." That sentiment was universal. The Second Corps became fanatically loyal to George Smith Patton. They understood that his harsh discipline had saved their lives and given them victory. Lieutenant Colonel Hap Gay, Patton's chief of staff, observed, The general transformed those men from defeated soldiers into confident warriors in 10 days. I've never seen anything like it. He willed them to victory through sheer force of personality and tactical brilliance. The strategic impact extended to future campaigns. The success at El Guettar convinced Allied planners that American forces were ready for the invasion of Sicily, then Italy, then France itself. Without Patton's victory, the timeline for liberating Europe might have been delayed by months or even years. German forces defending Sicily, when they learned that George Smith Patton commanded the United States 7th Army landing on the island, requested additional reinforcements. They had heard what Old Blood and Guts had done in North Africa. They knew they faced a dangerous opponent. Italian forces were even more demoralized. "If Patton is coming," one Italian general reportedly said, "we should surrender now and save ourselves the casualties." The victory also established the template for how George Smith Patton would fight for the rest of the war. Aggressive offense, rapid movement, exploitation of enemy weakness, and personal leadership from the front. In North Africa, he proved that studying your enemy, really studying them, understanding how they think and fight, could be as valuable as superior numbers or equipment. Rommel was a tactical genius, but Patton had outthought him strategically. By attacking first at El Guettar, Old Blood and Guts had forced the Desert Fox to abandon his planned offensive and react defensively, something Rommel rarely had to do. Military academies began studying the El Guettar campaign immediately. The United States Army Command and General Staff College added Patton's battle plan to its curriculum as an example of seizing and maintaining initiative against a superior opponent. One training document from 1944 noted, "General Patton's transformation of Second Corps demonstrates that leadership, discipline, and aggressive tactics can overcome prior defeat and low morale. His victory proves that American soldiers, properly led, are the equal of any fighting force in the world." That last point was crucial. Before El Guettar, there was legitimate question about whether United States troops could match German veterans in combat. After El Guettar, there was no question. American soldiers could fight. They could win. They just needed leaders like Old Blood and Guts to show them how. The aftermath of Patton's victory resonated in another unexpected way. It established psychological dominance. German soldiers who'd laughed at Americans after Kasserine now feared them after El Guettar. That psychological shift was worth divisions of troops. Captured German documents from later in the war repeatedly referenced Patton tactics: aggressive armored thrusts, rapid, exploitation, refusing to yield initiative. Wehrmacht commanders warned their troops to expect these tactics from all United States units, even though they were specifically Patton innovations. Old Blood and Guts had essentially taught the entire United States Army how to fight by his example in North Africa. And through it all, George Smith Patton remained the warrior general, leading from the front, risking his life alongside his men, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That was why they called him Old Blood and Guts. His blood, their guts. Together, unstoppable. Today, more than 80 years after George Smith Patton defeated Rommel without ever facing him directly in battle, military historians still study what happened at El Guettar as a masterclass in leadership and strategy. The United States Army War College includes Patton's North African campaign in its required reading. Officers studying for command positions analyze how Old Blood and Guts transformed a defeated force into a victorious army in just 10 days. They examine his methods: strict discipline, personal example, aggressive tactics, and thorough study of the enemy. What Patton did in March of 1943, writes military historian Carlo d'Este, was nothing short of miraculous. He took troops who'd been shattered at Kasserine Pass and turned them into the force that defeated Rommel's Africa Corps. This wasn't just about tactics or strategy. It was about will. Patton imposed his warrior will on an entire army corps and transformed them. British historian Max Hastings, initially skeptical of American military prowess in World War II, writes, "One must acknowledge that Patton's achievement at El Guettar was remarkable. He outthought Rommel strategically, which few Allied commanders managed to do. By attacking first and seizing initiative, he made the Desert Fox's planned offensive impossible. It was brilliant generalship." The legend of George Smith Patton Old Blood and Guts, rests on many campaigns. Sicily, where he raced Montgomery to Messina and won. France, where his Third Army broke out of Normandy and liberated vast territories. The Battle of the Bulge, where he pivoted his entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours to relieve Bastogne. Germany itself, where he drove deep into the heart of the Third Reich. But it all began in North Africa, at El Guettar, when an American general studied his enemy so thoroughly that he could predict his moves and counter them before they happened. When Old Blood and Guts proved that the United States Army had finally arrived as a world-class fighting force. The pearl-handled pistols, the profane speeches, the absolute demand for discipline and excellence, the personal courage to stand under fire alongside his men. All of it combined to create the legend. German generals who survived the war admitted in interviews that they feared 3 Allied commanders above all others: Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov for his brutal, overwhelming force, British Field Marshal William Slim for his tactical brilliance in Burma, and American General George Smith Patton for his aggressive unpredictability. You could anticipate what most Allied commanders would do. One former Wehrmacht general said in a 1950s interview, "They followed doctrine, established procedures. But Patton, he would attack when you expected defense. He would appear where you thought impossible. He fought like a German panzer general, perhaps better than most German panzer generals." That was the ultimate compliment from an enemy who'd faced the best commanders on every front. Today, at the United States Military Academy at West Point, cadets still study Patton's campaigns. They learn his principles. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won by men. Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. The statue of George Smith Patton at the Academy shows him as he appeared in World War II, ramrod straight, those famous pistols on his hips, eyes scanning the horizon for the next battle. It's inscribed with his most famous quote, "Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." At El Guettar in 1943, Old Blood and Guts accepted the challenge of facing Rommel's Africa Corps with a defeated army. He felt the exhilaration of victory when he outthought the Desert Fox and forced Germany's greatest general into retreat. That's why they called him Old Blood and Guts. That's why his legend endures. That's why, when the United States needed a warrior general who could salvage disaster and forge victory from defeat, they called on George Smith Patton. He never disappointed them. The lesson of El Guettar echoes through military history. Study your enemy, lead from the front, demand excellence, attack aggressively, and never accept defeat. These principles, embodied by Old Blood and Guts, won the battle that saved American honor and changed the course of World War II in North Africa. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was beaten by an American general who understood that wars are won, not just on battlefields, but in the preparation beforehand, in the discipline instilled in troops, in the will to attack when others would defend. George Smith Patton beat Rommel without ever facing him directly, because he'd already won the battle in his mind, in his planning, in his transformation of the Second Corps from defeated soldiers into warriors. That is the essence of military genius. That is the legend of Old Blood and Guts. And that's why, more than 8 decades later, we still remember the day in March of 1943 when General George Smith Patton proved that the United States Army could defeat anyone, anywhere, anytime, if led by commanders with his warrior spirit and tactical brilliance. If this story of Old Blood and Guts' triumph over Rommel moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold moments from General George Smith Patton, history's greatest combat commander, because legends like this deserve to be remembered, studied, and celebrated. The next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember El Guettar. Remember how George Smith Patton took a broken army and made it victorious. Remember how he defeated the greatest German general of World War II without ever meeting him face to face on the battlefield. Remember Old Blood and Guts, the warrior general, the legend.